A racist cop got into a fight and punched a black, elderly judge because he thought she was beneath him and did not deserve his respect. Not only did her strength surprise him, but he also learned a great lesson. By the end of this story, he wished he had not thrown the first punch. But by then it was too late. To better understand this story, we need to go back to the very beginning. If you believe in what's right, in treating people fairly, no matter the color of their skin, hit that subscribe button and join the movement. Only those who do not care for justice will refuse to subscribe. Now let us begin. The courtroom was a pressure cooker, ready to explode. Judge Martha Benson sat tall behind the bench, her sharp eyes moving over the crowded room. She had ruled on hundreds of cases, seen every shade of arrogance and guilt, but this one felt heavier. This one mattered. Officer Travis Boone sat at the defense table, legs stretched out, arms crossed. A smirk played on his lips. He wasn't nervous. He never was. The system had always worked for him, not against him. And today would be no different. Across the room, Prosecutor Daniel Redd adjusted his tie and turned toward the jury. Ladies and gentlemen, what you just saw in that footage was not law enforcement. It was an assault. A defenseless young man, beaten while handcuffed and treated like an animal. The gallery stirred. A row of uniformed officers sat in silence, their faces unreadable. Boone let out a quiet chuckle, shaking his head. What a joke. Judge Martha's voice sliced through the air. Officer Boone, she said, steady and firm. This is a courtroom, not a locker room. Show some respect. Boone's smirk widened. Respect? He muttered, just loud enough. Daniel continued, his voice rising. The victim was left with broken ribs, a shattered jaw. And for what? Because he asked why he was being stopped. Martha's grip tightened around her gavel. She had seen injustice before, but none like this. Officer Boone, she said coldly, you are not above the law. The smirk was gone now. Boone's jaw tightened. His fingers curled into fists. Boone's behavior in the courtroom was audacious. As the witness testified, he couldn't contain his impatience. Rolling his eyes and muttering under his breath, he seemed to think no one could hear him. He slouched in his seat, his arms crossed, clearly uninterested in the proceedings. Judge Martha's voice cut through the growing tension. Boone, she said sharply, her gaze fixed on him. I'm warning you, if you continue to disrupt this court, I will hold you in contempt. Boone chuckled lowly, leaning back even further in his chair. Contempt, he muttered, his tone dripping with sarcasm. What are you going to do? Send me to detention? The room fell silent for a moment, the tension thickening. Martha's eyes narrowed. This is your final warning, Boone. Show respect in my courtroom, or you will face the consequences. Boone shrugged carelessly, the defiance in his posture unmistakable. I don't need to listen to you, lady, he sneered under his breath. You're old and out of touch. The air seemed to freeze as the words left his lips. Everyone in the courtroom shifted, the discomfort palpable. Boone had crossed the line, but he seemed oblivious to the storm brewing around him. Martha took a deep breath, her eyes never leaving his. You may think you're above the law, Boone, but in my courtroom, you will show respect, she said, her voice low and unyielding. But Boone only smirked, not backing down. The standoff between them was far from over, and the room held its breath, waiting to see who would break first. As the closing arguments began, a tension hung in the air like a storm waiting to break. The room had been simmering for days, the case growing more contentious with every passing hour. But Boone, ever the troublemaker, couldn't hold his composure any longer. He shook his head, a mocking grin spreading across his face. Then, without warning, he let out a loud, exaggerated chuckle that reverberated through the courtroom. His laughter wasn't just out of place, it was a direct challenge to Martha's authority. The sound grated against everyone's nerves, as if he were daring her to do something about it. Judge Martha's eyes flashed with fury. Her patience had long since worn thin. Boone, she snapped, her voice like a whip. Silence this instant. But Boone, far from intimidated, stood up. His chair screeched loudly as he shoved it back, the sound echoing in the room. Every eye in the courtroom followed his movements as he swaggered toward the bench, his posture defiant, his fists clenched. You think you can control me, huh? He sneered, his voice low but carrying enough venom to make the hairs on the back of everyone's neck stand up. I don't answer to you. Security guards shifted uncomfortably at the edges of the room, exchanging nervous glances. They were supposed to maintain order, but Boone wasn't just anyone, he was one of their own. A cop. They hesitated, unsure if they should intervene. But Martha's glare was enough to break the silence, her eyes locked on Boone with an intensity that could melt steel. "Sit down, Boone." "Now," she commanded, her voice unwavering. But Boone wasn't done. His defiance was reaching its boiling point, and there was no turning back. He took another step forward, towering over her with a look of contempt that could freeze the room. "You think I care about your rules? You don't scare me, lady. I'm done with this charade." The tension in the courtroom exploded. People shifted in their seats, some gasping, others holding their breath. They could all feel it, the air thick with the weight of what was about to happen. Then, without warning, Boone's hand shot out. The courtroom gasped collectively as he threw a punch. The sickening sound of flesh hitting bone echoed across the room. His fist connected with Martha's face, sending her staggering back. Her glasses flew off, and she gripped the edge of the desk to keep herself steady, her face twisting in shock and pain. For a split second, the entire courtroom was frozen. The scene felt surreal, as if the world had stopped moving. Some of the spectators couldn't believe their eyes. Martha, the seasoned judge who had commanded respect for years, had just been struck by one of her own. A cop. The punch wasn't just a physical blow. It was a slap in the face to everything the courtroom stood for. A stunned silence fell over the room, broken only by the sound of Martha's shaky breath. For a moment, everyone expected her to crumble, to back down in the face of such open violence. But they didn't know Martha. She wasn't one to back down. Not now, not ever. Martha straightened herself, her hands still gripping the desk. Her face burned with a mix of pain and fury. But something else, something deeper, was beginning to stir within her. The fire in her eyes wasn't just a flicker anymore. It was a blaze, an inferno of resolve that made it clear. Boone had made the gravest mistake of his life. With all her strength, she swung back, her fist connecting with Boone's jaw in one fluid motion. The force of her punch was enough to send him reeling back into his chair, his head snapping to the side. His eyes widened in shock as he struggled to comprehend what had just happened. The room erupted into chaos. "Get him out of here," someone yelled from the back. Security moved quickly, surrounding Boone, but he was still dazed, his hand pressed to his jaw, trying to steady himself. He looked up at Martha, his expression a mix of disbelief and fury, but there was a new look in his eyes now. Fear. Martha didn't flinch. She stood tall, unshaken, her chest rising and falling with the weight of the moment. The room was still buzzing with disbelief, but there was a new energy in the air. Respect. For a moment, it felt as if time itself had paused. Boone tried to stand again, his legs shaky, but the security guards grabbed him by the arms and forced him back down into his seat. He didn't resist. He was no longer the confident man who had stormed into the courtroom minutes ago. He was just another man, defeated by the very woman he had tried to break. Martha looked down at him, her voice cold but unwavering. "I warned you, Boone. Now you'll pay the price for your disrespect." The room was silent now, the tension hanging like smoke. But in that silence, something had changed. Boone had crossed the line, and in that one incredible moment, Martha had shown the world just how far she would go to maintain order in her courtroom. She wasn't just a judge. She was the law, and no one was above it. The fallout from the courtroom altercation was swift and unforgiving. The media exploded with headlines. "Judge fights back." The world couldn't get enough of the story, dissecting every moment, every word. Some praised Martha for standing her ground, hailing her as a symbol of courage and strength. A true leader who knows when to fight. One headline read, while others were less kind. "Unprofessional outburst," one critical outlet argued. "A judge who can't keep her cool," said another. But the most unsettling part of it all was Boone's response. In an exclusive interview, Boone played the victim, his face a mask of righteous indignation. "She hit me first," he claimed, his voice trembling as if the punch had been an unprovoked attack. "I was just defending myself, and she went crazy on me. She's the one who lost control, not me." The public ate it up. The narrative shifted. The focus was no longer on his violent outburst in court, but on Martha's reaction. It was as if the world had forgotten the reason for the confrontation in the first place. People rallied behind Boone, some even holding signs outside police stations, demanding that she be held accountable. Protests erupted in Briarwood. Marchers filled the streets, chanting for justice. "Martha's no hero," one sign read. "Respect our police." Another group formed near the courthouse, demanding that Boone be reinstated. The pressure mounted with each passing day, and it felt like the town was about to break apart at the seams. Amidst the chaos, Martha's fate was sealed. She was suspended pending investigation, a decision that sent a wave of shock through the community. Her colleagues were silent, some avoiding eye contact, while others whispered behind her back. She knew the outcome was inevitable, but the sting of betrayal still cut deep. At home, Martha sat in front of the TV, her hands shaking as she watched the news coverage unfold. She had been strong in court, unflinching in the face of Boone's disrespect, but now, in the quiet of her living room, the weight of it all hit her. Was it enough? She whispered to herself, tears welling up in her eyes. The familiar faces on the screen, reporters, pundits, seemed so far away, so disconnected from the person she had become in the last few days. All she had done was fight for what was right. Why did it feel like she had lost everything? She turned off the TV, the silence in the room oppressive. As the weight of her emotions threatened to swallow her whole, she decided to take a walk. She needed to be alone, away from the press, the protesters, the constant reminders of what had happened. Martha stood at her late husband's grave, the place where she had always gone for solace. The cold wind whipped through the trees, but she didn't feel it. Kneeling down, she placed a hand on the worn stone, her fingers trembling. "I stood up for myself," she whispered softly, her voice breaking. "Did I do the right thing?" Her husband's grave offered no answers, only the quiet stillness of the cemetery. She closed her eyes, allowing the tears to fall freely now. For the first time in years, Martha didn't feel the strength that had carried her through life. All the walls she had built around herself were crumbling, and she didn't know how to stop it. The sound of footsteps behind her made her turn. A dark figure emerged from the shadows, holding an envelope in hand. Without a word, the person placed it at her feet and walked away, disappearing into the distance before Martha could even ask who they were. She picked up the envelope, her hands still unsteady, and tore it open. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a message scrawled in dark, jagged handwriting. "Step down or pay the price." Martha's heart raced as the words sank in. She stared at the paper for a long moment, the threat heavy in her hands. But something inside her hardened, like iron forging in a furnace. She couldn't be intimidated. She couldn't let this be the end. She stood up, her jaw set, her mind made up. She had worked too hard, sacrificed too much, to back down now. "I put hours into researching and telling these stories for your viewing and educational pleasure. Just tap that little red button. It takes half a second, but means the world to me." Later that evening, her daughter, Emma, found her on the porch, her face drawn with worry. "Mom, please," Emma pleaded, her voice cracking with concern. "You don't have to keep fighting this. It's not worth it. They're coming after you. You're not safe." Martha shook her head, her eyes steely. "I didn't get where I am by backing down, Emma. And I'm not going to start now." Emma grabbed her hands, pleading with her mother to let it go, to walk away from the storm that was consuming their lives. "You don't have to prove anything to anyone, Mom. I just want you safe." Martha's heart twisted at the sight of her daughter's fear, but she couldn't stop. Not now. Not after everything that had happened. "I've come too far to be silenced," she said, her voice a quiet promise. "I'll fight this, Emma. I have to." Emma's eyes filled with tears, but she said nothing more. She knew her mother too well. Once Martha had made up her mind, there was no changing it. And so Martha stood resolute, the weight of the world on her shoulders, yet unbroken. She would face whatever came next, no matter the cost. The day of Boone's trial had arrived, and the air in the courtroom was thick with anticipation. Gone was the cocky cop who had walked in so arrogantly weeks ago. Now Boone was the one in the defendant's chair, his face drained of color, his arrogance replaced by a palpable sense of fear. His past brutality was about to be laid bare for all to see. The victims who had suffered at Boone's hands began to take the stand one by one, each recounting their harrowing experiences. There was Sarah, the young woman he had assaulted during a routine traffic stop. Her voice trembled as she described the abuse, but there was no turning back. Every word was a testament to the violence Boone had inflicted. Then came Jason, the man who had been falsely arrested and beaten in an alley, and Maria, who had witnessed Boone's violent outbursts time and time again in their community. Their testimonies painted a chilling portrait of a man who had used his badge as a weapon, terrorizing anyone he saw fit. Each account chipped away at Boone's defense, but it wasn't just the victims' voices that spoke volumes. It was the footage of the courtroom altercation. The video, captured by a hidden camera, showed the shocking moment when Boone had thrown the first punch. The jury watched in stunned silence as the footage played on the screen. It was undeniable. Boone wasn't just a cop who had made a mistake. He was a man who had let power and arrogance blind him to the very principles he had sworn to uphold. The trial went on, but the verdict was inevitable. When the judge finally returned to deliver the final ruling, Boone's face was pale, his eyes hollow. Martha, sitting at her place on the bench, felt a quiet sense of justice settle over her. The weight of everything she had endured, the threats, the protests, the pain, had led to this moment. And she knew deep down that it had all been worth it. "Boone, you are hereby found guilty of assault, misconduct, and abuse of power," the judge pronounced, her voice unwavering. "You are sentenced to 25 years in prison, with no chance of parole." A ripple of relief ran through the courtroom, and then, as if on cue, the room erupted in applause. It wasn't just the victims or their families who were cheering, it was everyone who had fought for justice. The people who had seen Boone for what he truly was. They had been waiting for this moment, and now they were witnessing it. Boone, for all his bravado, had no response. He sat there, stunned, unable to process the weight of his downfall. His life, once filled with arrogance and power, had come to a screeching halt. Outside the courthouse, the scene was different. As Martha walked out, the weight of the trial still heavy on her shoulders, she was met with a roar of support. People lined the steps, holding signs that read "Justice for All" and "Martha Benson, our hero." The cheers were deafening, but it was the faces in the crowd that mattered the most to her. A young black girl ran up to Martha, her face shining with admiration. "Judge Benson, you're my hero," she exclaimed, her voice full of awe. Martha's heart swelled, and she knelt down to meet the girl's eyes. "Thank you," Martha said, her voice thick with emotion. "But you're the real hero. Never forget that." The girl smiled and hugged Martha, and in that moment, Martha realized the true impact of her fight. It wasn't just about her. It wasn't about the courtroom or the judgment. It was about standing up for what was right, no matter the cost. It was about showing the world that justice wasn't just a word. It was a responsibility that belonged to each and every one of them. As Martha stood back up, the crowd continued to cheer, their support washing over her like a wave. She hadn't just fought for justice in the courtroom. She had ignited something in them, a spark of hope, a belief that they could make a difference too. The door to the courthouse opened, and Martha stepped out into the sunlight, the weight of the trial finally lifting off her shoulders. She was exhausted, but there was a sense of peace in her heart. The fight had been long, but it had been worth it. The injustice that had seemed so insurmountable had been confronted, and now, the world knew the truth. As Martha made her way through the crowd, a voice rang out, loud and clear. "Justice isn't given. It's taken back, one fight at a time." The words echoed in her mind, the final truth of everything she had endured. It wasn't just about Boone. It was about all the times justice had been overlooked, ignored, or manipulated. But today they had taken it back. And with that, Martha knew she had done her part. The fight was far from over, but she had lit the spark. And the world would never be the same. As the crowd continued to cheer, Martha took a deep breath, her smile unwavering. She had stood up, and now, the world had stood with her. If you believe in justice, equality, and the fight against police brutality, make sure to like, share, and subscribe to this channel. Together, we can amplify these stories and demand change. Hit that subscribe button now, because not hitting it would mean you want to be silent. I will see you in my next story. The end.